It's been more than 3 months since the much talked about and long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russian troops officially kicked off in 2023. Since then, many critics point out that Ukrainian progress has been meagre for such a long period of time. A village here, a town there. At times, the extreme slowness of the Ukrainians to break the Russian front lines has generated doubts, questions, and news stories like these.
Is Ukraine's counteroffensive failing? Kiev and its supporters worry about losing control of the narrative. A stalled offensive and a winter stalemate, for instance, would have particular ramifications in the United States since it could heighten questions over U.S. support for the war that will be pushed into an acrimonious election year. The counteroffensive is difficult. It is happening probably slower than how some people may want or can see it. There is fatigue in our eyes, but there is fear in their eyes, and these are two very different things.
Yes, it is clear that things are not moving as fast as some had hoped. Even so, we do not jump to conclusions so quickly. In the face of the pessimism, the alarmism expressed by many media outlets, and the tremendous impatience of those who believe that a real war is something like the game Battlefield, the reality on the actual battlefield may be very different. Yes, the Russians are putting up a fierce resistance, but what do you expect? Nobody surrenders right off the bat, much less an army that in volume is still huge. To give you an idea, it is estimated that the Russians currently have more than 400,000 military personnel deployed in Ukraine. This is something that we on VisualPolitik have repeated several times. Attacking and gaining territory is not the same as defending and holding it. That is usually a much more costly operation. And of course, it is now up to the Russians to defend. VisualPolitik viewers, the counteroffensive is concentrating not only, but particularly on the Zaporizhia Oblast. The goal, break the Russian defensive lines, also known as the Surovikin line of honor of the ousted former head of the Russian armed forces in Ukraine. Apparently, the first major objective would be to reach Melitopol, and once there, to cause the Russian defenses in the region to be extremely exposed to Ukrainian artillery. Now, this is not an easy mission at all. The truth is that the Surovikin line, the Russian defensive lines, have been fulfilling their function so far, which is to slow down and make the Ukrainian advance much more costly. And this has been unfolding pretty much as we told you. For example, it is reasonable to think that the Ukrainians could use their Leopards and their Western troop transport vehicles to try to break through Russian defenses in areas near Melitopol, Berdyansk, and even Mariupol, instead of focusing so much on the Donbass as they have done so before. And that attack could start in Zaporizhia Oblast. All these obstacles will not be an impediment for the Ukrainians to pass, but rather a hindrance, a delay that could leave Zelensky's troops exposed for longer than recommended in hostile territory. Yet at the end of August, we were faced with news items like these.
Ukrainian troops have crossed the first of the Russians' 3 main trench lines. Robotyne is first Ukrainian breach in Russian lines of defense. The capture of the small village is seen as an important step in the counteroffensive aimed at cutting the land bridge between Russia and Crimea, and thus suffocating Moscow's forces in the occupied areas to the south.
It was the first clear break in the front line. Since then, the offensive has picked up some speed, and the gap has just kept getting bigger and bigger. The Ukrainian hope is that once the main line is cut, the Russian defense positions beyond that will not be so prepared. Of course, we're talking about a small advance on the map, and that is why the doubts have not been dispelled. In fact, many analysts already point to 2024 and even 2025.
Ukraine cannot win against Russia now, but victory by 2025 is possible.
In contrast, other analysts, including the Ukrainians themselves, point out that the counteroffensive has only just begun.
Combat actions will continue in one way or another. In the cold, wet, and mud, it is more difficult to fight. Fighting will continue. The counteroffensive will continue.
The question, therefore, is where exactly are we? How is the counteroffensive going? What can we really expect from the Ukrainian military macro operation? Are we looking at a failure, announcement, or near victory? Well, in this video, we're going to answer all these questions, so let's get into it. By the way, if you like what we do, want to receive exclusive content and help us improve? Join our Patreon community. You can receive exclusive reviews, special videos, and lots of freebies. But you already know all that. The important thing is that, above all, you will help us to keep growing and keep improving. You see, usually on the screen, you see us, Grant, and me, but the truth is that VisualPolitik is so much more. It is a team of young professionals who work every day to bring you the best possible content. VisualPolitik viewers, we are eager to keep on improving and carry out new initiatives. And that's why you help us a lot by being a part of Patreon. Initiatives such as increasing the number of videos per week or launching VisualPolitik were largely initiatives that we were able to push forward thanks precisely to our Patreon community. I'll leave all of the info in the description down below, but at this point and from the bottom of my heart, a million thanks to all of you who are already part of VisualPolitik's Patreon. And now, let's go to Ukraine.
Putin's artificial ventilator.
In medicine, when a person is seriously ill, he is often put on a ventilator. Well, making a parallel with Putin, we could say that Surovikin's defensive lines in Ukraine are the artificial respirator that keeps the Russian dictator's leadership on its feet. The collapse of Russian defenses in the occupied Ukrainian territories could be devastating for Vladimir Putin's grip on power, which is precisely why the Russian leader is pulling out all the stops, so to speak.
Russia, seeking a bigger army, moves to raise the top age for military service. Russia is reaching for a range of tactics to cajole or coerce men to enroll in the military, as it looks to buttress its defenses in Ukraine without resorting to a mass mobilization that could cause political and social friction at home.
The point is that at the time of making this video, this artificial ventilator of Putin's, the defensive fortifications, might be starting to crumble, at least in some key areas. As you have already seen, the Ukrainians have already managed to break the Surovikin line around the town of Robotyne. From there, they are now trying to widen that crack towards Verbov and advance towards Tokmak, a strategic locality that is literally surrounded by Russian physical defenses, practically a 21st century wall the Russians have made and will continue to make every effort to prevent Tokmak from falling. That's because this location is an important junction of roads and also has a railroad. In other words, it is an important communications junction vital for the supply of Russian troops. Of course, before reaching Tokmak, there are still several fortified sublines to overcome. That is what the Ukrainians are working on in the hope that these lines will be weaker than the first one. In any case, even if they succeed, it is an operation that will take time and a lot of sacrifice. Likewise, there is also a second Ukrainian advance front active in the area of Velkya Novosilka in Donetsk Oblast, with which they intend to get closer to Berdyansk. What's more, operations around Bakhmut are also underway. And more recently, the Ukrainians have also launched a pressure operation on Optyne, Donetsk's city airport. The fact is that after the developments in late August and early September, the general discourse in the media has been changing very fast.
Ukrainian counteroffensive pierces main Russian defensive line in southeast. After 3 months of grinding advances in Western-backed operation, Kiev accelerates thrust along main line of attack.
But I insist, this does not mean that it's done and dusted for the Ukrainians and that from now on the war will be a piece of cake. But it does show one thing. In general, the lack of patience is making the media and many analysts too pessimistic. After all, wars practically never have a linear development. Defenders can hold their positions for a long time and then break down and collapse in a matter of days or weeks, forcing them to mobilize forces from elsewhere and thus weakening the entire defense as a whole. Barely 12 weeks have passed since the start of the counteroffensive, and that, in military terms, implies that it is still at an early stage. Penetrating through fortified defenses is an extremely complicated task. To give you an idea, the US military has only conducted this type of operation twice in modern history, and both times were against Iraq. In 1991, they succeeded after bombing the Iraqis relentlessly from the air for 39 long days, and then dropping 650,000 troops on them from both the United States and the international coalition formed to liberate Kuwait. And in 2003, they did it again, with an already very weak Iraqi army in just a few days, but also after intense air bombardment operations. Apart from this, there is no recent precedent for anything like what the Ukrainians face on the southern flank. The big difference is that Ukraine has none of the strategic advantages that the United States had in those two wars against Iraq. The Ukrainians have no air supremacy, cannot operate over Russian lines, and cannot prevent Russian planes and helicopters from attacking Ukrainian troops as they try to advance. In addition, despite large donations of Western weapons, Ukraine does not yet have sufficient quantities of armored intrusion systems. Precisely for this reason, the Ukrainians are also trying to be more cautious. And of course, the enemy factor is also important. The Russians have a much larger and better equipped armed forces than the Iraqis did. The defenses prepared to hold the occupied territory have been extremely robust, with wide belts of mines, anti-tank ditches, dragon teeth, and trenches. What's more, Russian soldiers are also equipped with numerous drones that are directing artillery attacks and are taking advantage of the advances of Ukrainian troops to counterattack when the Ukrainians are more worn out and tired. Let me repeat. Nobody said it would be easy. Putin's future may come to depend on this operation, and naturally, a collapse on Russian lines would be practically irreversible. It is the artificial ventilator we were telling you about, and there is no way they can allow it to fall, whatever the cost. Now, many of you may be wondering what might happen with both sides, and what, given the circumstances, are the strengths and weaknesses of the Ukrainians and the Russians. Am I wrong? Well, we're going to take a look at that next. Pay close attention.
At the point of no return.
The counteroffensive is at its peak. The ammunition rounds fired by both sides are at a maximum, and this is visible even in the most unsuspected details. For example, take a look at this graph on forest fires in Ukraine. What you see is the number of fires in the natural environments that are directly related to the bombings. As you can see, not only are they much higher than last year at this time, but also the parts that are suffering the most from those fires are precisely those controlled by Russia. That indicates that the Ukrainians are gaining significant fire superiority and are causing enormous attrition on the Russian front. However, that has not been enough to achieve a lightning breakthrough. Now, why is that? Well, here we enter the realm of strengths and weaknesses. Russia's first strength is, not surprisingly, that the defender almost always has an advantage over the attacker. Thanks to that, Russia is taking a defensive approach known as elastic defense. The Russian elastic defense consists of using a first line of Russian troops facing the initial Ukrainian attack, and then falling back to more solid defensive positions. When the Ukrainians advance, and we are usually talking about several hundred meters or 1 kilometer at most, they suffer huge losses from mines, artillery, and helicopter and drone attacks, which wears them down and exhausts them. It is just then when the Russians typically try to launch a counterattack, which in many occasions are successful and force the Ukrainians to retreat back to where they were, or in the best case scenario, to positions that make the advance extremely slow. It is pure and tough attrition. And of course, in order to carry out this strategy, above all, it is necessary to have enough men, and this is precisely one of Russia's strengths. It has a manpower mobilization potential 3 to 4 times greater than that of Ukraine. That's simply because its population is much larger, and also because many Ukrainian men of fighting age are abroad as refugees. In fact, practically the only urgent task already being undertaken by the Russian government to sustain the front against the Ukrainian counteroffensive is precisely to tap that potential. To this end, Russia has passed a new law that allows it to discreetly send draft notices to as many men as the government wants. It has raised the age of compulsory military service from 27 to 30 and has not ruled out raising it again in the future. Russian men unlucky enough to receive the draft order are sent an electronic notification, and automatically the Russian borders are closed to them, invalidating any attempt to leave the country. What's more, the new law has also increased the penalties for refusing to serve in the military. All this is accompanied by a fresh shower of public money on the military industry to produce weapons and ammunition for all these people, and they are even negotiating deals with countries like North Korea for ammunition supplies. So basically, in theory, we could think that Russia has a greater capacity than Ukraine, both to increase the size of the forces involved and to regenerate their ranks. Besides, as you know, the Kremlin does not care at all about casualties, a certain psychopathy that also helps to keep the front line manned. But of course, the Ukrainians are still advancing, so it hasn't all been so positive for the Russians. Moscow is still having far more headaches than joy during the Ukrainian counteroffensive. At the strategic level, the geometry of the theater of wars favors Ukraine, even though it is not in a defensive position. You see, the Russians are in a phase in which they have to defend the ground lines of communication, known in military jargon as GLOC. GLOC. These lines consist of roads and a railway network running from Rostov-on-Don in Russia to Crimea. It is through these lines that food, fuel, ammunition, personnel, and all necessary supplies come in, traveling by road or rail. All this explains, for instance, why the Russians have fortified Tokmak and the Kerch Bridge, which has already suffered at least 2 major attacks, and now even has barges supporting underwater anti-drone water nets. If the Ukrainians managed to reach the shores of the Sea of Azov, or at least get very close to them, they would have succeeded in cutting off the Glock from the Russians. The whole operation could be triggered as a result of the breakup of Robotyne, of Velkia, Novosilka, or by another new route, if the Ukrainians managed to penetrate and jump the Russian fortifications on the battlefront. From there, the Ukrainians would also have all the Russian defensive capacity within artillery range, which could collapse in a short time. Let us repeat. According to many military strategy and intelligence reports, the Surovikin line is absolutely key. If it collapses at any point and the Ukrainians break through, the Russian military could be between a rock and a hard place. It would be a point of no return. But that brings us straight back to the first question. Could it happen? Is it really possible for the Ukrainians to cause the Russian defenses to collapse? Well, obviously it is known, but the results certainly would be attractive. That behind that hope could be news like this.
Biden edges closer to decision on supplying Ukraine with long-range missiles.
So there you have it. Everything indicates that the United States could be about to deliver the long-awaited US Army Tactical Missile System. Missiles that can accurately attack targets located at a distance of up to 300 kilometers, or almost 190 miles. With these missiles, the Ukrainians could make it very difficult for the Russians to supply the front line, which could make it easier for part of it to fall. So far, Ukraine has managed to balance the strength of its artillery with the Russian artillery, and even surpass it in certain areas. With these terribly accurate missiles that Russia would not be able to stop, the defense of the occupied territories in Ukraine would become even more costly. Another key factor will be the ability of the West to continue sending advanced armaments and armor to the Ukrainians. For the time being, the Abrams are already on their way, and more could arrive soon. And let's not forget, also on the table is the future delivery of F-16 aircraft, a reasonably good aircraft when it comes to attacking ground targets. In other words, far from what many pessimists predict, in the medium term, the Ukrainian campaign could even gather speed. But we don't even have to go that far. The 2023 counteroffensive may not achieve its most ambitious goals, but let's not be impatient. For now, the news is beginning to be quite positive. We'll see what's in store for us in the times ahead. But one thing to keep in mind, the campaign is not going anywhere near as badly as many are suggesting. On the contrary, many Ukrainians are starting to be very optimistic, and in any case, much more so than they were a month or a month and a half ago. Of course, with the onset of winter, everything may slow down again. Be that as it may, it's now time for you to have your say. Will Russia be able to hold its defensive line? Will Putin's regime be able to withstand the internal pressures that another massive mobilization of Russian men may bring? Well, leave us your opinion here below in the comments. And remember, if you like this video, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel to keep up to date with all the latest news. You can also collaborate with VisualPolitik by joining our community on Patreon in exchange for exclusive content and benefits. We'll leave you the link in the description. As always, thank you so very much for being there. All the best. See you next time.